This is the story of January 11th, 1944, when American P-51 Mustang fighters fought the largest air battle over Germany since the catastrophic Schweinfurt raid 3 months earlier. 60 American heavy bombers fell from the sky that day, more than 39 German fighters were destroyed, and 1 American pilot earned the only Medal of Honor, awarded to a fighter pilot in the European theater, by single-handedly defending a bomber formation for 30 minutes against overwhelming odds. Before we go any further, we need to address something that's been repeated in documentaries, books, and articles for decades. You've probably heard that January 11th, 1944 was the day German pilots saw P-51 Mustangs for the first time over their homeland. That story has become part of the legend, which makes it unfortunate that it's not true. German fighters first encountered P-51B Mustangs over Germany on December 13, 1943, during an escort mission to Kiel, and that was nearly 6 weeks before January 11. Heavy combat at Bremen and Wilhelmshaven on December 20th meant the Luftwaffe had already been fighting Mustangs for more than a month by the time this mission took place. So why does January 11th, 1944 matter if it wasn't the first encounter? Because while it wasn't first, it was the encounter that proved what the Mustang could do. The Luftwaffe threw everything they had at American bombers that day, an estimated 500 fighters, and still couldn't stop them. A single American pilot in a Mustang held off 30 to 40 German fighters alone, and the mission demonstrated beyond any doubt that long-range escort fighters had changed the air war over Europe forever. We need to go back to the beginning and understand how we got here. The crisis in strategic bombing. By January 1944, the American daylight bombing campaign was at a crossroads, and the theory behind it had seemed simple enough. Heavily armed B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators flying in tight defensive formations could fight their way to targets deep in Germany, drop their bombs with precision, and fight their way back home while escort fighters protected them part of the way and the bombers' own guns saw them through the rest. Reality proved far more brutal than theory. October 14, 1943, a date known in the 8th Air Force as Black Thursday, saw 291 bombers strike the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt. The target was critical to German industry, but the losses were catastrophic for the Americans. 60 bombers were shot down, another 17 were damaged beyond repair, and more than 600 airmen were killed or captured in a single afternoon. The reason was simple and deadly. Fighter escorts could only go so far before running out of fuel, which meant P-47 Thunderbolts had an effective combat radius of about 375 to 475 miles, and P-38 Lightnings could reach out to perhaps 520 to 585 miles, but suffered constant mechanical problems in the cold European weather. Neither could escort bombers all the way to targets in central Germany and back, which left the formations on their own beyond escort range, and German fighters knew exactly where that point was. The strategic bombing campaign couldn't continue like this. Deep penetration missions were suspended while planners searched for a solution, and the invasion of France, scheduled for the following summer, meant Allied commanders needed air superiority over Europe before the first soldier stepped onto those beaches. What they needed was a fighter that could go all the way to Berlin and back. They needed the Mustang. The Mustang's unlikely birth. The story of the P-51 Mustang is one of the most surprising in aviation history, and it almost didn't happen at all. April 1940, months before the Battle of Britain, the British Purchasing Commission approached North American aviation with an urgent request. Britain needed fighters desperately. They needed them fast, and they wanted NAA to build Curtiss P-40 Warhawks under license. NAA's president, Dutch Kindleberger, made a bold counterproposal that must have sounded crazy at the time. Instead of building someone else's fighter, give us 120 days and we'll design you a better one. The British were skeptical but agreed, and what happened next was extraordinary. The first prototype, designated NA-73X, flew on October 26, 1940, just 149 days after the contract was signed. Edgar Schmude, a German immigrant who would later design the F-86 Sabre-jet fighter, led the design work and delivered exactly what he'd promised. The Mustang was fast, maneuverable, and had exceptional range thanks to its laminar flow wing design, but there was one problem that kept it from being the aircraft it could be. The Allison V1710 engine was the weak link in an otherwise excellent design. The Allison was a good engine at low altitude, but it used a single-stage supercharger, which meant above 15,000 feet its power dropped off dramatically. Early Mustangs could reach 390 miles per hour at 15,000 feet, but they couldn't maintain high performance at the altitudes where bombers and enemy fighters operated, so the RAF and USAAF used them for low-level reconnaissance and ground attack. They were excellent in those roles, but they weren't the answer to the bomber escort problem. That changed in May 1942, when a Rolls-Royce test pilot named Ronald Harker flew a Mustang I at the company's test facility. He recognized something the Americans hadn't seen yet, which was that this exceptional airframe was being held back by its engine. Harker suggested fitting the Mustang with the Rolls-Royce Merlin 61, the same two-stage supercharged engine that powered the Spitfire 9, and the combination was revolutionary. The Merlin-powered P-51B could reach 441 miles per hour at 30,000 feet compared to 390 at 15,000 for the Allison version, and its service ceiling jumped from around 31,000 feet to 42,000 feet. The Merlin maintained peak power at 23,500 feet instead of dropping off at 11,800, but the real game changer was range. With internal fuel and two 75-gallon drop tanks, the P-51B could achieve approximately a 600-mile combat radius, which meant it could escort bombers to Berlin and back, something no other Allied fighter could do, and it was cheaper than its rivals, costing about $50,000 to build, while a P-47 Thunderbolt cost $83,000 and a P-38 Lightning cost $97,000. The first P-51Bs arrived in England in November 1943 and went to a unit that would make history: the Pioneer Mustang Group. The 354th Fighter Group earned its nickname, the Pioneer Mustang Group, because it was the first USAAF unit equipped with Merlin-powered P-51Bs, and these men would be the ones to prove what the Mustang could do in combat over Europe. The timeline was remarkably compressed and speaks to how quickly things moved in wartime. November 1st, 1943, the group arrived in Liverpool aboard HMS Athlone Castle, and they established themselves at RAF Boxted in Essex on November 13th. Less than 3 weeks later, December 1st, they flew their first combat mission, a fighter sweep over St. Omer and Nocca. December 13th brought the first escort mission into Germany, flying to Kiel with a combat radius of 490 miles, a record at the time, and 3 days later, on December 16th, they scored the first confirmed enemy aircraft destroyed by P-51Bs. By January 11, 1944, the 354th Fighter Group had been in combat for 6 weeks, which meant they weren't rookies anymore. They knew their aircraft, they knew how to fight, and they'd already proven the Mustang could reach deep into Germany and survive. The group consisted of 3 squadrons, the 353rd, 355th, and 356th Fighter Squadrons, and the 356th was commanded by Major James Howard. Howard had flown with the Flying Tigers in China before the war and scored 6 aerial victories there, and his P-51B carried the nickname Ding Hao, Chinese for very good. 49 P-51Bs from the 354th Fighter Group took off from Boxed on the morning of January 11th to escort bombers striking deep into the heart of Germany. Mission 182, the plan. 8th Air Force Mission 182 was ambitious in scope and targeted the industrial facilities producing the aircraft that were destroying American bombers. The primary target was the AGO Flugzeugwerke at Oschersleben, a factory that had become the principal center of WWII production after Allied bombers destroyed the Marienburg plant back in October. Secondary targets included the Junkers facility at Halberstadt, which manufactured Ju-88 wings, and aircraft factories at Brunswick. The force assembled that morning was massive and represented the kind of industrial power only America could bring to bear. 663 heavy bombers, 525 B-17 Flying Fortresses, and 138 B-24 Liberators would be protected by 592 escort fighters, a mix of P-47 Thunderbolts, P-38 Lightnings, and the 354th Fighter Group's P-51B Mustangs. The plan called for fighters to provide continuous coverage throughout the mission, with P-47s escorting the bombers on the early part, P-38s taking over in the middle, and the P-51s providing target area coverage at the most dangerous part where the bombers were most vulnerable and German fighter concentration was heaviest. But as often happened in war, the plan didn't survive contact with reality. When plans fall apart. Weather over Europe that day was deteriorating, and as the mission progressed, recall orders went out to many fighter units. The P-47 groups turned back. Most of the P-38 groups turned back, but the 1st Air Division and elements of the 3rd Air Division, the bomber formations heading for Oschersleben, and the other targets pressed on. The 354th Fighter Group continued to the target area, which created a dangerous situation. Of 3 fighter groups originally assigned to provide target area coverage, only the 354th made it all the way, and that meant 49 P-51Bs would be protecting hundreds of bombers at exactly the moment when German fighters would hit them hardest. The Luftwaffe had been tracking the American formations since they crossed the coast and knew where the bombers were going, knew when the escorts would have to turn back for fuel, and were assembling the most aggressive fighter response since Schweinfurt. Approximately 500 Luftwaffe fighters scrambled that day, and about 207 would directly engage the American formations. They included Bf-109s, FWW-190s, Bf-110 twin-engine destroyers, Me-210s, and even Ju-88 and Do-217 bombers modified as heavily armed interceptors. The Luftwaffe's strategy had evolved after months of bloody combat into what they called the Gefechtsverband, a battle formation system where heavily armored FW-190A8 fighters, nicknamed Sturmbach or battering ram, were designated as bomber destroyers. They would press home attacks at close range, using their armor to survive defensive fire, while Bf-109G fighters escorted them and engaged American fighters to protect the Sturmbach formations. The theory was sound but had a critical weakness in practice. The large German formations took a long time to assemble and were difficult to maneuver, which meant if American fighters could get among them before they formed up or break their formation, the system fell apart. That required having enough American fighters at the right place at the right time, and on January 11th over Oschersleben, there weren't enough. The battle develops. The bomber formations pressed on toward their targets, while the weather scattered them somewhat, making them more vulnerable, and the recall of most escort groups left them dangerously exposed. That's when the Luftwaffe hit, and the attacks were intense and sustained. Wave after wave of German fighters pressed in, while twin-engine destroyers fired rockets into the formations from beyond defensive gun range, and single-engine fighters came in from 12 o'clock high, diving through the formations with their cannon and machine guns blazing. The 49 Mustangs of the 354th Fighter Group found themselves vastly outnumbered and did everything they could. They broke up German formations before they could attack, chased off fighters pressing attacks on the bombers, and dogfought with covering Bf-109s, but there were simply too many German fighters and too few American escorts. Bombers began to fall in ways that bomber crews would remember for the rest of their lives. Some went down trailing smoke and flame. Others simply fell out of formation with their crews bailing out if they could. And some exploded in midair when cannon shells hit their bomb loads or fuel tanks. The crews still flying pressed onto their targets through flak and fighters, held their formations, made their bombing runs, and turned for home while the air battle raged around them. And in the middle of all this chaos, one American fighter pilot found himself completely alone, defending an entire bomber group by himself. 1 man against 30. Major James Howard had led his squadron, the 356th, toward the bomber formations as planned. But in the swirling confusion of combat, his squadron became separated, and his wingman's aircraft developed trouble and had to turn back. Howard found himself alone in the sky, with the 401st Bomb Group below him, dozens of B-17s heading home after their bombing run, still deep over enemy territory, and converging on those bombers were approximately 30 to 40 German fighters. What happened next would earn Howard the Medal of Honor and become one of the most extraordinary individual actions of the air war. For the next 30 minutes, Howard single-handedly defended that bomber formation by diving into the German formation and scattering their attack. He shot down one fighter, then another, and when the Germans tried to reform and attack again, he hit them from a different angle, breaking up their attacks again and again before they could press home. 3 of his 4 guns jammed during the extended combat, a common problem with early P-51Bs during high-G maneuvers, but he kept fighting with 1 gun. His fuel ran critically low, but he kept fighting, and the Germans had overwhelming numerical superiority, but he kept fighting anyway. Bomber crews watching from their positions called out on the radio asking who that crazy guy was. They couldn't believe what they were seeing, one fighter taking on what looked like half the Luftwaffe and refusing to break off. The official Medal of Honor citation states that Howard destroyed 3 enemy airplanes and probably destroyed and damaged others, though accounts vary on the exact number. Some newspaper reports at the time claimed as many as 6 victories, and gun camera film was sent to headquarters for analysis, but the chaos of such an extended solo engagement made precise attribution difficult. The official USAF credit lists 3 to 4 confirmed. The exact number almost doesn't matter, though. What matters is that for 30 minutes, a single P-51 pilot prevented a massacre, and the 401st Bomb Group made it home because of what James Howard did that day. CBS correspondent Andy Rooney, who covered the war, called it the greatest fighter pilot story of World War II, and Howard received his Medal of Honor from Lieutenant General Karl Spaatz in London on June 27, 1944. He remains the only fighter pilot awarded the Medal of Honor in the European theater of operations during World War II. I should note here that Howard is sometimes described as the only fighter pilot awarded the Medal of Honor in all of World War II, but that's not quite accurate. First Lieutenant Raymond L. Knight received the Medal of Honor for actions in Italy in April 1945, though that was technically in the Mediterranean theater rather than the ETO. The more precise statement is that Howard was the only P-51 pilot to receive the Medal of Honor in the European theater. The cost. When the surviving bombers finally made it back to England, that evening the cost of Mission 182 became clear in numbers that shocked even veteran crews. 60 heavy bombers had been lost across all 3 target areas, not 60 from a single formation as some accounts claim, but the total across Oschersleben, Halberstadt, and Brunswick combined. The breakdown tells the story of where the fighting was heaviest. 34 B-17s were lost at Oschersleben, with another 2 damaged beyond repair. 8 B-17s went down at Halberstadt, and 18 bombers, 16 B-17s, and 2 B-24s were lost at Brunswick. From the Oschersleben element alone, approximately 122 men were killed, 235 were captured, and 83 aircraft returned damaged but repairable, numbers that meant entire crews simply vanished that afternoon. Fighter escort losses were comparatively light at 5 fighters total, 2 P-47s and 3 P-38s, and the P-51s of the 354th Fighter Group all made it home, though several were damaged. On the German side, Luftwaffe losses reached 39 fighters destroyed from approximately 207 directly engaged in the combat. When you consider that the Luftwaffe scrambled an estimated 500 fighters total for the day's defense, that attrition rate of roughly 19% of those directly engaged was devastating for an air force already stretched thin. Let me put those numbers in context because they matter. January 1944 overall saw 30.3% of all Luftwaffe single-engine fighters written off, meaning destroyed, damaged beyond repair, or lost to all causes, and fighter crew losses reached 16.9% for the month. These were losses the Luftwaffe could not sustain and could not replace. Every experienced pilot killed was irreplaceable in ways that numbers alone can't capture. Germany's pilot training program was already breaking down under the strain of the war. New pilots were reaching combat units with fewer and fewer flying hours, while American pilots were arriving in England with extensive training and would get even more experienced as the air war continued. Now I need to mention something about the loss claims, because combat statistics from both sides were inflated, not through dishonesty but because of the chaos of air combat. American bomber gunners claimed 174 German fighters destroyed, 32 probably destroyed, and 63 damaged from just the Oschersleben element, and the American Air Museum notes these figures are probably exaggerated because they're right. In the confusion of combat, with multiple bombers firing at the same aircraft and fighters diving away trailing smoke that might be damage or might be a tactical maneuver, accurate assessment was nearly impossible. The same happened with German victory claims, which also exceeded verified American losses, but the overall picture is clear. Mission 182 was a brutal, costly battle that demonstrated both the risks and the possibilities of the new era of long-range escort. The German perspective. German reactions to the arrival of long-range American fighters ranged from official denial to desperation, and their responses tell us a lot about how the war was going for the Luftwaffe by early 1944. According to Adolf Galland's memoir, The First and the Last, when P-51s first appeared over Germany, the official Luftwaffe position was that there were no long-range daylight fighters over Germany, a denial so complete that High Command simply refused to believe it was possible. Galland himself investigated by flying an WWII with another Luftwaffe general to see for himself, and they encountered Mustangs. The other general was shot down, and Galland escaped only through a clever trick where he fired his guns forward while turning, creating smoke and shell casings that made the pursuing Mustangs think they were being attacked from behind. They broke off and Galland got away. There's a famous quote often attributed to Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, that goes, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the jig was up," and that quote has been repeated countless times. We need to be careful with it, though, because the verified version from the USA Air Intelligence Summary of Göring's post-war interrogation states that he considered long-range fighters one of the most decisive factors in the ultimate outcome of the war, and when fighters appeared over Berlin, he knew the results would be tragic. He likely said something close to "the jig was up," but the exact phrasing appears to be a paraphrased legend rather than a direct quote, though the sentiment was accurate either way. The Luftwaffe tried to adapt through developing the Gefechtsverbund battle formation system I mentioned earlier, concentrating their forces for maximum impact and developing new tactics specifically for engaging escort fighters while getting bomber destroyers through to the B-17s and B-24s. None of it was enough to change the fundamental problem. American fighters could now go anywhere the bombers went, which meant the Luftwaffe couldn't simply wait for the escorts to turn back anymore. They had to fight all the way to the target and all the way back. And increasingly, American fighters weren't just defending bombers, but hunting German fighters and attacking their airfields and destroying them on the ground. The air war was slipping away from Germany, and the arrival of the P-51 Mustang in force was a major reason why that was happening. Why the Mustang made the difference. Let me break down exactly what made the P-51B such a game-changing aircraft, because the numbers tell a story that explains why it dominated the skies over Europe. Performance at altitude was the first advantage and maybe the most decisive. At 30,000 feet, the P-51B could reach 441 miles per hour, which made it faster than any German fighter at combat altitude. The Bf-109G could manage about 428 miles per hour at 23,000 feet, and the FW-190A8 topped out around 408 miles per hour at 20,600 feet, and both German fighters lost. Performance as altitude increased while the Merlin engine kept the Mustang strong up to 42,000 feet. This meant German fighters couldn't catch a Mustang if the American pilot wanted to disengage, couldn't outrun it, and couldn't outclimb it at high altitude. A P-51 pilot could choose when to fight and when to break off, which is a massive tactical advantage in air combat. Range was the second advantage, and the one that changed everything strategically. With drop tanks, the P-51B could fly about 600 miles into Germany and still have fuel for combat and the return trip, while a P-47 Thunderbolt, even with drop tanks, had an effective combat radius of 375 to 475 miles. That gap of 125 to 225 miles was everything. The difference between bombers facing the full fury of the Luftwaffe alone versus having fighter support throughout the mission. Combat effectiveness was the third advantage and what pilots cared about when the fighting started. The P-51B was highly maneuverable and could turn, with German fighters in a dogfight, was well armed with 6 50 caliber machine guns, and was durable enough to take battle damage and bring its pilot home. Early P-51Bs did have problems that often get glossed over in popular accounts. Gun jamming during high-G maneuvers was common, as Howard experienced during his Medal of Honor mission, and coolant system failures occurred while abort rates were high in the early months. Pilot Mike Rogers of the 353rd Squadron noted that frequently over half the unit would have aborted by target time in the early operations. But these problems were addressed, and by spring 1944, the P-51's reliability had improved dramatically. Even with early mechanical issues, the Mustang's strategic impact was undeniable. The turning point. January 1944 was when the air war fundamentally changed, and Mission 182 on January 11th was part of a larger pattern that was reshaping the strategic situation over Europe. That same month, General James Doolittle took command of the 8th Air Force and implemented what became known as the "let 'em hunt" doctrine. Instead of keeping fighters tied closely to bomber formations, Doolittle authorized them to pursue German aircraft aggressively, and if they saw German fighters forming up, they should attack them before they could hit the bombers. And if they saw German fighters landing, they should strafe them on the ground. The strategy was ruthless and effective in ways that compounded over time. German fighters had to fight from the moment American formations crossed the coast until they left German airspace with no safe place to form up and no safe place to land and refuel. The Luftwaffe was being ground down through constant attrition that replaced experienced pilots with inexperienced ones and destroyed aircraft faster than factories could build them. By March 1944, during Big Week, a series of massive raids against German aircraft production, the 8th Air Force was dispatching over 900 bombers with more than 800 fighter escorts on single missions. The scale was overwhelming and demonstrated industrial capacity the Germans simply couldn't match. By D-Day on June 6, 1944, Allied air supremacy over the invasion beaches was essentially complete, and German fighters made almost no appearance during the landings. The Luftwaffe had been so reduced that it could no longer effectively contest Allied air operations over France. This wasn't solely because of the P-51 Mustang, but the result of pilot training advantages, numerical superiority, strategic targeting of German industry, and multiple other factors. But the Mustang made it possible by giving American fighters the range to go anywhere, the performance to win fights, and the numbers to be everywhere at once. By the end of the war, 14 of the 15 8th Air Force fighter groups had converted to P-51s. Total Mustang production reached over 15,000 aircraft, and the P-51 had become the dominant American fighter in the European theater. The bigger picture. Let me step back and address why accuracy matters in telling these stories, because it's easy to think that small details don't matter when the overall story is so dramatic. The narrative that January 11, 1944 was the first time German pilots saw P-51 Mustangs is compelling and dramatic and makes for a great story hook. It's also wrong by about 6 weeks, and that matters more than you might think. If January 11th had been the first encounter, it would suggest the Mustang's impact was immediate and total, but the reality is more nuanced and actually more impressive. The 354th Fighter Group had been flying combat missions for 6 weeks by January 11th, which means they'd been learning how to use their aircraft, developing tactics, working out mechanical problems, and building experience in real combat. By January 11th, they weren't green pilots in untested aircraft having their first combat, but veterans who knew what they were doing, flying aircraft whose capabilities they understood, facing a Luftwaffe that had already learned over 6 weeks of hard fighting that these new American fighters were dangerous. The Germans knew the Mustangs were out there, had fought them, had lost aircraft to them, and on January 11th, they threw 500 fighters at the American formations and still couldn't stop them. That's the real story. Not surprise discovery, but the dawning realization that no amount of desperate effort could overcome the fundamental shift in strategic balance that had occurred. Similarly, the Göring quote, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the jig was up," might not be exactly what he said, but the sentiment was real. Post-war interrogations confirm that German leadership understood long-range escorts were decisive, and we don't need to put words in their mouths to make the point. The documented facts are dramatic enough without embellishment. 60 bombers lost in a single mission, nearly 40 German fighters destroyed, one American pilot holding off 30 German fighters for half an hour. These things actually happened, and we don't need to embellish them. Legacy: the P-51 Mustang went on to become one of the most successful fighter aircraft of World War II, serving beyond the European theater in the Mediterranean, the Pacific, and virtually every theater of the war. Edgar Schmood, the designer, would go on to create the F-86 Sabre jet fighter, which dominated the skies over Korea a few years later, using many of the same design principles he'd pioneered with the Mustang. James Howard survived the war with 6 victories in China with the Flying Tigers and either 3 or 4 victories in Europe, with sources varying on the exact count for his January 11th mission. After the war, he remained in the Air Force and eventually retired as a brigadier general, published his autobiography, Roar of the Tiger, in 1991, and passed away in 1995. The 354th Fighter Group completed 362 combat missions before the war, destroyed 701 enemy aircraft, earned 2 Distinguished Unit citations, and produced multiple aces who would be remembered long after the war ended. But perhaps the most lasting legacy is this. The P-51 Mustang proved that strategic bombing could work and that the theory could become reality. Without long-range escorts, the daylight bombing campaign was unsustainable, as the losses at Schweinfurt proved. But with the Mustang, American bombers could strike targets throughout Germany with fighter protection all the way there and back. This enabled the systematic destruction of German oil production, transportation networks, and aircraft factories, achieved air superiority over Europe in time for the Normandy invasion, and demonstrated that air power properly applied with the right tools could achieve strategic effects that changed the outcome of the war. Let's come back to where we started, because the truth matters even when the legend is more dramatic. January 11, 1944 was not the day German pilots saw P-51 Mustangs for the first time. That happened approximately 6 weeks earlier, but it was the day that demonstrated in the starkest possible terms what the Mustang meant for the air war over Europe. The Luftwaffe mounted its most aggressive defense since Schweinfurt and still couldn't prevent American bombers from hitting their targets. 60 American heavy bombers were lost, but the crews who made it home knew they'd had fighter protection deeper into Germany than ever before. James Howard proved that a single determined pilot in a capable aircraft could hold off overwhelming odds through skill, courage, and sheer stubborn refusal to quit. And the mission made clear to American planners, to Luftwaffe commanders, and to the bomber crews who depended on escort fighters for their survival that the balance of air power over Europe had fundamentally shifted. The Mustang didn't win the war by itself, because wars are won by soldiers, sailors, and airmen across all services, by industrial production, by strategic decisions, and by countless individual actions, large and small. But the P-51 Mustang gave the Allies a tool they desperately needed at exactly the time they needed it, gave American fighters the range to go anywhere, gave them the performance to win fights when they got there, and gave Allied commanders the confidence to plan the most ambitious amphibious invasion in history, knowing they would own the skies when it happened. That's the real story of January 11, 1944, not a myth about first encounters and surprised Germans, but the hard, complex, bloody reality of air combat at its most intense, and the emergence of an aircraft that changed what was possible in the skies over Europe. The men who flew these missions, both American and German, deserve to have their story told accurately, because they faced death in the frozen sky above Europe, watched friends die, and showed courage in circumstances most of us can barely imagine. The least we can do is get the facts right when we tell their stories, and the facts, when you look at them closely, are extraordinary enough without any embellishment at all.